If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter those into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will pass those on to Shannon, our presenter. At the end of the presentation, we will invite you to fill out a quick feedback survey. Anyone who does will be eligible for one of 2 free subscriptions to Green Teacher magazine. So who is Green Teacher? Some of you may know, for some of you, this may be your first time. We are a nonprofit organization based in Southern Ontario, Canada. We produce a quarterly magazine that shares innovative articles, activities, and lesson plans from educators both in and outside K-12 classrooms across North America and internationally. Also, over the past 14 years, we have published several books, the 2 most recent and the most relevant to this evening's webinar, Teaching Kids About Climate Change and Teaching Teens About Climate Change.
Thank you.
Each of these books contains a treasure trove of lessons and approaches to climate change education. We encourage you to purchase a book, subscribe to our magazine, and doing so will allow us to continue offering free webinars, which is increasingly important in these times of lockdown. We're also very fortunate to have multiple webinar partners in Canada, as well as across the United States. So a big thank you to our webinar partners. And for today's webinar, our feature partner is the Columbia Basin Environmental Education Network. So thank you to the CBEEN for all of their support. Our presenter this evening, Shannon Subers, wrote the article Expanding the Toolkit in our fall 2019 issue of Green Teacher. Shannon is a science communicator, artist, and conservation educator based in San Diego, California. As an education specialist with San Diego Coastkeeper, her daily work takes her into K-6 classrooms to teach students about ocean pollution. Shannon holds an MA in biology from her Advanced Inquiry program, which is a joint effort between Miami University and San Diego Zoo Global. Her graduate research involves combining art and science to better communicate conservation. We're very pleased to have Shannon with us. Everybody who is tuning in live to this webinar, Shannon.
All right, well, thanks so much for that introduction, Ian, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here digitally and for taking the time out of your day to be a part of the webinar. So I'm really excited to have all of you, and it's really awesome to see where everyone's joining us from, whether that is close to home for me in California or whether that is all over North America, Canada, even New Zealand, which is really cool for me. So I hope that what we talk about today will give all of you some ideas that you can help incorporate into your own teaching practice. What we saw from our little pre-survey was that we have folks from a lot of different institutional types. We have a lot of formal educators in K-12 classrooms. We have outdoor educators, informal educators. I myself focus primarily with elementary, middle school, a little bit of high school. And I kind of call myself a semi-formal educator because most of the time I am going into other folks' classrooms to deliver presentations. So hopefully, no matter which age group you work with, you'll find the things that we're talking about to be relevant. Just got to see some of our audience poll results, so thank you, Ian, for summarizing those as folks trickled in. Like I said, we've got people joining us from all over North America, we've got some international folks, and we also have people working in a variety of environments. So I think that that will help us with leading a really productive discussion since we have such a wealth of experience. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today. First, I want to talk about why we should teach climate change. I'm sure that some of that will be preaching to the choir a little bit, but I think it's really important to kind of go back to our roots and see why we're doing this in the first place. And while I touch on that, I also want to touch on kind of the ways that we have taught it previously and some of the challenges or gaps that have been identified with the ways that climate change has been taught. And then I want to talk about some ideas about how we could teach it. I'll be talking kind of about my approach, which is derived from the approach that I used in my Green Teacher article, and also some strategies to incorporate this into your own classroom. Obviously, we have folks from so many different environments that it's going to be kind of up to you to customize, but I hope that the way that we present it that there will be some really helpful takeaways for you to use in your own practice. And then after we're finished, we will have some time for question and answer session, which Ian will be moderating for me. So without further ado, let's get started. As Ian mentioned in the beginning, there was a really interesting NPR Ipsos poll that I read about a couple of months back. This was a survey of over 500 educators across the US in 2019. And from this survey, it was all about teaching climate change. 55% of this survey respondents said that they don't teach climate change in their classroom. And one of the really interesting things that I found about this survey was that not only did they ask participants if they did, they also asked them some of the barriers or challenges. And one of the most common ones was 65% of those teachers, when asked why they don't teach climate change, said that it's outside of their subject area. Now, I found this really interesting. I think it goes back to a pretty common idea that climate change and other environmental issues are really only meant for the science classroom. This is something that I pretty heartily disagree with, but I understand the reasons why folks feel like they can't tackle this or they shouldn't tackle this maybe if they are not a strict science teacher. And even for folks that are science teachers, it can be a really overwhelming topic to tackle. So through this, I'm hoping that I can show you why I think that educators of all disciplines can tackle it, and if they have the opportunity and resources to, they should. And we're going to kind of talk about why I think that way. So let's start off with talking about how climate change has historically been taught. The way that climate change has been taught in the past isn't always an approach that's very conducive to action. Now, much like the critiques of science education, environmental education that have been brought up by things like the next generation science standards. So for those of us living in the US, that's probably pretty familiar. For those that aren't familiar, the next generation science standards, or abbreviated to NGSS, they are basically a set of content standards that have been adopted by many of the states in the US. And they kind of ushered in a new approach to science education that has focused a little bit less on just the content and a little bit more on skill building. So some of the critiques of science education that were brought up by the introduction of these standards was that the way that science is taught historically is not always representative of how scientists work in the real world. For example, with climate change, a lot of times the focus was placed very heavily on the mechanisms of climate change, things like the carbon cycle, or like greenhouse gases, or glacial melt. And it oftentimes was handled in isolation rather than being treated as an interdisciplinary subject, which I think is reflected in the fact that out of those teachers that said that they didn't teach climate change, a lot of them felt that it wasn't relevant to their classroom for whatever reason. Not that it wasn't an important issue, but that they didn't have the tools to teach it. And unfortunately, with the way we've taught climate change in the past, a lot of times the solutions or advocacy component comes almost as an afterthought at the end of the unit, rather than providing students the chance to take ongoing actions and to kind of question their role in this phenomenon. So from what we know about kind of the psychology of environmental behavior, we know that when people get overwhelmed with information, they tend to shut down. A lot of conservation marketing initiatives have focused on trying to shift away from just info dumping on people and instead promoting more of a behavior change type approach. So if we go back to kind of our primary objective for teaching climate change, I think that most of us would probably agree that when we teach climate change, our goal at some point is to get students to care about it and to act on it, to do something that will reduce the severity of climate change in the future. And so if we know that people tend to shut down when they get overloaded with information, and we know that we want them to do something, then just giving a ton of information about the scientific mechanisms without really talking about the behavior piece isn't necessarily our best approach. It's important, obviously, for students to understand why and how the things associated with climate change are happening, and that will involve us going into the scientific mechanisms. But when we just talk about the hard science of it, it's not necessarily the most effective way to get kids to care and act. Now, I feel like a connection or a parallel to this would be our current global pandemic. A lot of times when folks turn on the news nowadays, they are bombarded with information, it's constantly changing, and I've seen a couple of pretty common responses: fear, panic, or shutting down. And this is something that is almost an evolutionary mechanism for us. It is something that is helping us kind of preserve our sanity. Maybe these responses are conditioned at a pretty early age or a part of our history. But basically, our psychology is working against us here. When we are presented with something of global scale that has a lot of constantly evolving information that maybe doesn't have the most clear solutions, people tend to shut down. So the same thing happens with climate change. It's a global complex issue. There's a lot of stuff going on with it. And sometimes the solutions are not always the most clear. So because we know how important it is for people to know how to work towards solutions, we want to make sure that we're finding ways to teach it, that it's going to overcome these psychological barriers that are kind of hardwired into us, and focusing on what we can do so that we don't get overwhelmed and shut down. Now, why should we teach climate change? Like I said in the beginning, probably preaching to the choir here, I'm hoping that everyone here has at least some idea of why they want to teach climate change if they don't already do, or what their purpose is if they already teach it. But basically, our students are going to see more change in their lifetime than any of us will. These students are coming into a world that is in turmoil in many different ways: economic, political, social, and environmental. And so we want to make sure that we are leaving our students, if we're going to be leaving our students this world, we want to make sure that we're leaving them with the best tools that they can to cope with it. Uh, and part of that is being able to care and being able to do something about it. So when we teach them about climate change, it actually can help improve their civic engagement and their environmental literacy, depending on how we teach it. Because if we're focusing on different aspects of climate change, like how we can make political progress, then we can bring in a civic engagement aspect. So there's a lot of different ways that we can bring this in, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we're basically giving them the tools to understand this complex problem and figure out how to move towards solutions. And also, we're preparing tomorrow's scientists and politicians and activists. So I think that it's really important that we're talking about this at as many levels as we can, bringing in different perspectives so that these kids, they're going to have to make decisions on this in the future, so that they are getting exposed to this from a young age and that they are going to be aware and able, feel prepared to make a difference. So how can we teach climate change? That's a loaded question, right? Now, this is just my approach that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but it's kind of informed by my intersection between the sciences and the social sciences. I was educated with an anthropology background and then conservation education, so that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. So my approach, I advocate for something that I've informally named the socio-ecological approach. So the colors here are just to help you break this into the two most important parts. So if we're looking at the socio-ecological approach, we've got our socio. By socio, I am not only referring to the social component, but also the economic, cultural, and political components. But we've also got the ecological, right? So basically, the way I envision this approach is that we take an environmental problem and we look at it in terms of the ecological effects, right? What is it doing to our planet, our ecosystems, et cetera? But also, how is this environmental problem embedded in our social context? Because we really can't separate the social context from environmental issues. As much as scientists sometimes like to pretend that we can, there's really an embedded socio context in all environmental issues, right? They don't exist in a vacuum. So this is kind of a main tenet of this whole idea, this whole teaching approach for me, is that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Although a lot of times the way that we are teaching, our schools separate us into different departments, or we're separating our courses out by academic field. Science itself is a very interdisciplinary field, and especially when it comes to applying science into the real world, science cannot function on its own. So this is kind of the why behind this whole approach. If anyone had the chance to read my article from Green Teacher, this is something that I talked about in the article, is that the social context is often what makes a conservation solution succeed or fail. So my article focused on marine protected areas, so basically like underwater national parks, um, and how with marine protected areas, you can take one of those and let's say you find a really great spot with a ton of biodiversity and you're like, cool, I'm gonna plop this marine protected area right here. That's great. But if you aren't familiar with the social context of that area, then there's a chance that you might be hitting some barriers that you didn't expect just from studying the biodiversity. For example, what are the cultural lifeways of that area? What are the economic impacts of putting a marine protected area there if you have, for example, a high value fishery? There's a lot of different things that contribute to the success of conservation initiatives that are outside of the realm of just the nature part. So that's kind of a key tenet behind this whole thing, is that when we understand the social workings of environmental issues, we're going to be much better prepared to solve them. And ideally, when we're teaching with this socio-ecological approach, we want our students to leave with the understanding that an environmental issue is not just a science issue, it's also an issue from all these other disciplines. There's things that feed into it, and that's going to help them be really literate about this issue. So I'd like to show you some examples that I feel like are really good at illustrating this kind of tenet. This photo depicts members of the Swinomish Nation in the Pacific Northwest, so kind of northwestern Washington. And these tribal members are participating in the photo in a clam restoration activity in British Columbia. So tribal communities have been especially affected by climate change and are often some of the first people to feel the effects of climate change. Some of the ways that tribal communities are affected by this include being certain cultural or religious holidays being impacted by changes in the seasons. So if you have an event that is centered around the harvest and climate change is starting to shift the harvest earlier or later in the year, then that's going to impact the timing of your cultural activities. In addition, practices that are carried on from a very long legacy, like reindeer herding in Alaska, can be impacted by climate change. So with the reindeer herding example, if you are relying on a solid layer of permafrost to herd these reindeer safely, but now with climate change, that permafrost is starting to melt, then that means that this traditional practice is going to be affected, and that's going to affect the culture of the people that practice it. But at the same time, tribes have also been really resilient to climate change and are often some of the earliest adopters of climate mitigation or adaptation strategies. So in this example, the clam restoration that's happening is actually a continuation of some really deeply rooted cultural practices for the Swinomish Nation. And it's being revived and brought back into the community as a way to provide some alternate food sources and to engage tribal members in ecological stewardship, which I think is really awesome. Other ways that climate change is already affecting us. If anyone here is from the West Coast, especially California, then you will probably recognize this photo. For those of you that are not, this is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And this was in the aftermath of the 2018 Camp Fire. The Camp Fire was actually the deadliest single fire in California's history. And 2018 was also the worst year for wildfires in California state history. Basically, this photo is showing smoke from the wildfires that were burning further east of San Francisco, but the smoke was traveling through San Francisco and impacting the air quality of many counties and cities in that area. This is not my photo, but I was actually in San Francisco during the weekend that the Camp Fire was at its worst, which was November, and it was pretty jarring. I'm located in San Diego, so typically we don't have to worry too much about really, really big wildfires. But this was quite the sight to behold. I remember when I arrived to San Francisco, I didn't have a respirator with me. I ended up obtaining one partway through the weekend, but I felt the effects of the air pollution myself. So it was quite the experience to see something like this firsthand, especially because I grew up in Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, where we didn't really have wildfires. So this was a very visible effect of climate change for me. And sea level rise is another really big example of how climate change is affecting people all over the world. It's a concern here in San Diego. It's a concern for a lot of Pacific Island nations like Kiribati. So Kiribati is a very low-lying island nation in the South Pacific. And unfortunately, a lot of folks there have already been displaced or preparing for immediate displacement as climate change is causing the global sea level to rise. This is also causing a lot of problems for the folks that are still there. So there are traditional taro pits that are dug into the soil, and as the seawater starts to rise and come into the villages, then that is impacting that really important food crop for them. So a lot of these communities are actually worried about becoming what we call climate refugees, basically being just displaced from their homes by the effects of climate change. So climate change, as we can see, has a lot of different effects, and none of these effects exist in a vacuum, right? When we talk about climate change in the science classroom, we can talk about sea level rise or wildfires or drought, but this all has connections to people's lives. So how can we kind of integrate this approach into our teaching practice? There's a lot of different ways that we can, either in the science classroom or in a non-science classroom, bring in other disciplines into our studies of climate change. So, for example, if you are a history teacher or if you're someone that covers history in your class, there are some really great opportunities to bring in climate change. I have had the opportunity to work with an 8th grade teacher who teaches history and government, and I got to see her use climate change as a lens, basically teaching about industrial revolution, which is part of the sequence already, and then using that as the opportunity to move into how has the climate changed since our industrial revolution? How has our carbon emissions increased exponentially since then, and why? There are also a lot of opportunities to talk about the role of government in climate change. What should the role be? And you can even bring in different campaigns like letter writing, writing to your state or local representatives, asking them to legislate a certain way, potentially, depending on what your school allows. Another thing that you can cover climate change through is English or language arts. So English teachers can use climate change as a framework for writing explanatory or persuasive texts. You can use climate change as kind of a framework for evaluating the accuracy or bias of different sources. I have been able to work with a teacher who covers this at the 6th grade level, and she does a lot of work with the students on basically evaluating sources for accuracy when the students are doing research. You can also use this as a way to delve into science communication or science writing. If you're teaching older students, it's a great way to talk about how do we take results from a scientific study, analyze them, and then spread them to a larger audience, whether that's within a scientific community that's more technical or with people that are not scientists. So this kind of lends itself well to reading and analyzing different scientific journal articles. Another way that we can integrate it is math. For those of you that have been trained in science, math is a really, really important part of doing science. So we can use math to talk about the importance of modeling different climate change scenarios. We can also use math to talk about how scientists collect and analyze data, and also how we represent data with things like graphs or tables or charts. And another way that we can talk about climate change is with art. So the artist for this picture is Jill Pelto. I highly encourage, if you haven't heard of her, go and look up some of her work. I encountered this artist during one of my master's degree classes, and I was instantly taken by her art because if you look at her art, she actually incorporates climate data into the art. So the lines of the fire in this art are actual graphs of climate data. So it's really interesting. Art is a really awesome tool to express our experiences with climate change, and also be used as an advocacy tool to create a call to action. And we can use it to present our data or results in different ways that might connect with people who feel a little bit like they don't have the technical knowledge to talk about climate. Art is a really great way to bridge that gap. And when we teach climate change in this kind of interdisciplinary way, this is going to help a lot of us with meeting the skill building requirements of our content standards. So again, for those of us in the US with the next generation science standards, a lot of this is focused on skill building as opposed to just content knowledge. And when we integrate these other disciplines, this is going to help us with meeting those content standards. And also it's going to be helping students to prepare for the skills that they need when they're out in the workforce. And especially for those of us who have students that are maybe have felt alienated by science. I know I was someone that for the longest time, I loved the environment and I felt like, I don't know if I can be a scientist though, because I'm bad at math. This is a really cool way to show students that we need people of all different disciplines working on scientific and environmental issues. So, how do we teach this approach? I've kind of given you some more general ideas, but now I want to talk about some like a little a process that you can work through when you would like to take this into your classroom. Now, again, these are going to be a little bit more general, and the idea is that they're customizable. So hopefully it'll kind of help you with charting out how you would do this. So first, you want to identify your phenomenon. The phenomenon is something that is going to tie the larger issue of climate change to your population. So I like to start this by thinking of something that's really local, that is an effect of climate change. For me in San Diego, this might be something like sea level rise. When I teach with this kind of approach with a local phenomenon or effect, it's going to show the students that although climate change is this really big global issue, it's going to have effects here in my community. And this is going to help show them that they are going to be affected by climate change. This can vary by geographic area. So like I said, San Diego, sea level rise is one of our concerns. If you are someone that lives in the mountains, that might not be a concern for you, but there are other frameworks that you can use to teach climate change and make it more local. It can even vary within pretty small geographic scales. So if I'm teaching students that are really like hyper coastal and are right by the beach, sea level rise might be a good idea. If I'm teaching students that are a little bit further inland and maybe they live in an area that doesn't have a lot of access to the beach or they haven't been to the beach before, that might not be as relatable to them. So instead, I might use something like the urban heat island effect, talking about how intense heat waves are going to get more intense kind of as a result of climate change. And also this will vary by age level. So with your older kids, you can scale up the topics. With your younger kids, you might need to scale it down. Once you've identified the phenomenon, you want to model your phenomenon. So I'm a really big advocate for hands-on inquiry-based activities. There are a lot of really awesome resources online, and we're going to share some resources after the webinar on how to do this for specific phenomena. So you can use things like modeling, games, role plays, interactive online tools. As much as possible, you want students to be able to engage actively with the content. And by making things hands-on and giving them the chance to engage actively, then you're going to help them build their own understanding. They're going to work out their kind of misunderstandings of the topic. Then, once you've kind of gotten a handle on what phenomenon you're doing with the students, then you want to bring in the social context. Now that the students have the background in the science, you want to bring in that more interdisciplinary work to give them a broader perspective on the issue. You can use things like role plays, roundtables, debates, discussions, case studies, or media to bring this approach into more of an interdisciplinary focus. And then, once we've talked about all these things, we would be remiss to not talk about solutions. Now, with solutions, it's really important to work solutions into your curriculum to combat the inaction and the desire to shut down, especially with younger kids. A lot of folks were asking earlier, how do we make this not as scary for our students. I think that it's really important that once you have them hooked, you have them knowing that this is going to affect them locally and that it's going to be a problem. You want to give them an outlet for it. So you want to let them know that, yes, this is going to be an issue, but there are things that we can do to stop it or to reduce its severity. So providing opportunities for the students to kind of apply what they've learned and create change in their own community. This can vary depending on, again, your geographic area, your political climate, even your students' socioeconomic status. So for example, if you have a lot of students that don't have air conditioning in their homes, then asking them to turn down the AC during the summer might not be the most relevant solution for them. But you know your students best. You can ask your students, talk to them, and kind of figure out ways to make this really relevant. When we work in solutions, this is a great way to bring in something that we call climate hope. So we want to be realistic, but also give them the sense that they can make a difference. Because if we do all this and then we're like, okay, that's it, and we don't give them the sense that they can make a difference, then it's not going to really allow them to feel like they have any agency in this issue. So one of the ways I like to do to keep things more hopeful is talking about student activists. So Greta Thunberg obviously comes to mind, but there's a lot of really amazing students around the world that are working on this issue. I really like to advocate to highlight Greta Thunberg in addition to other student activists of color, women of color. There are lots of Indigenous youth that are doing amazing things for this as well. So I like to try and bring that in to show the students some representation within this movement. You can kind of work this in with like an activist of the day. So create a list beforehand with really short bios every day that you have those kids, pick something out of the box and have a kid read it aloud to the class. And then they will get the sense that, hey, there are kids my age that are working on this issue right now. So, you know, we want to let them know that kids can and do make a difference at all different ages. They don't have to be an adult to change this. And this is giving them something to fight for, right? If there's no action or hope component, then they're going to get discouraged, and this whole kind of thing can backslide into feeling too overwhelmed or feeling scared about it. And another thing that I like to talk about is always keep learning. I know that this is a really scary topic for educators. It's something that I myself am continually learning more about every day. The science is always changing, but the thing that's important is that we're out here and that we're trying, right? So I want to talk just really briefly a summary of some of the things we talked about. So remember, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It never has, it never will, and we don't want to teach it like it does. So that's why we're bringing in the socio-ecological approach, right? We're bringing in these different social aspects, showing how they connect with the science, and that way we're going to prepare students to take action and feel like there's something that's worth fighting for. So, as we're about to close up, I want to leave you with a quote from Greta Thunberg. She is a constant inspiration to me to really put my money where my mouth is and not just get comfortable sitting and educating, but also really make changes in my own life. So Greta says, I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day, and then I want you to act. I want you to act as if the house was on fire, because it is. Greta is here to remind us that although this topic can be scary and overwhelming, that we have an obligation to act. And as educators, we have a really critical role in preparing this next generation of students to tackle this issue. You can make a real impact in these kids' lives, and together we can all make a difference in preparing our students to tackle this issue for tomorrow. So, with that, I want to say thank you all so much for attending. I hope that what I covered today was useful for you and that you can kind of take these ideas and run with them in your own teaching practice. I have my contact information up here, and if you would like to get in touch with me to ask me questions or tell me something about how you have applied this approach, I would love to hear that. So please feel free to get in touch. I'd also like to say thank you to Ian and the team at Green Teacher for having me here to host a webinar. It's been a really awesome experience. We are going to hop into a Q&A session, so if you'd like to stick around, I hope you will. And again, thank you all for attending.
Yes, and thank you very much, Shannon, for delivering such an impassioned and extremely useful presentation, especially relevant right now, and particularly so with all of us experiencing a big shift in social norms that's changing day by day. I've been keeping track of questions and shared resources in the chat box. So I just want to go through a few of those points to sort of get us started into the Q&A here, because there's some great stuff flowing in. One of the recurring themes that a lot of people have written in the chat box is overcoming the fear of teaching this, and also teaching this in a way that doesn't completely scare students and psychologically shut them down. Certainly Shannon addressed that in the talk, but we can expand on that as needed if anyone has any more specific questions to dig specifically into that. A great comment though is that students do need to still understand the urgency of it, and I think ending with that Greta Thunberg quotation is a great entry point into that, and looking at student activists who are doing something and are taking action, yet are also admitting that this is an extremely serious situation. A few other points that came up in the chat box is just how to address this, particularly with the younger students, with kindergarten students. Let's start with that, Shannon, if you've got any particular insights for those with sort of the K-3 crowd.
Sure. Yeah, so this is something that I really empathize with. I'll tell you up front, there's no easy answer. As someone who works primarily with K-6, I know that there is a huge lack of resources for addressing this topic at a younger age. I have seen some really interesting and innovative approaches, especially with students in third grade. With the younger kids, I would probably recommend trying to focus on building those blocks, because a lot of the mechanisms of climate change, things like the greenhouse gas effect, things like the carbon cycle, are going to be hard for those kids to grasp. But we can start really young and start with observing changes that we see out in nature, start with building trust in science and talking about how and why scientists collect data and analyze results. And having the kids starting off, I think, with observing and collecting their own data at a pretty young age is something that is doable and will really help build up to that. So something that I might do is talk about weather with students as young as kindergarten, and you could integrate something like in the morning meeting or like a circle time in the beginning of the day. Every day, check the weather and keep a weather log throughout the year. That could be a way to kind of talk about making those observations, observing patterns, and that will serve you really well when you are working with those students a few years down the line. One of the things that you can also try is, if you're working with students, say around like second or third grade, you can talk about the effects of climate change in their area without necessarily going into all of the mechanisms behind it. So for example, if you want to cover climate change with third graders, you can talk about something that I've done before, sea level rise, model sea level rise with the students, do a hands-on activity, kind of get them understanding that this is happening in their area and that this will continue to happen, and scientists see that this will continue to happen based on data and models. And then you don't necessarily have to go into all of the nitty-gritty behind the mechanisms of climate change, but you're getting those students understanding that this is something that is observed, here's the data, we have records of this. So that's one way to try it, but I understand that this is really hard. There's not a lot of resources for those younger grades, so if anyone has suggestions, resources, I'd also love to hear.
Yeah, and on that note, I also mentioned that we'll send a follow-up email to all of the registrants. We'll do that tomorrow morning, and also this webinar will be posted, the recording will be posted on our website, greenteacher.com, tomorrow as well. So if you were furiously trying to take notes, fear not, this will be available. If you're a subscriber, you've got it forever. Yes. If you're not a subscriber, it will be freely viewable for 30 days. I'll also send the core text from the chat box, because lots of great questions, but also suggestions and resources that are coming in here. So I'll be sure to share that in that follow-up email that'll go out to everyone tomorrow. Just gonna go back. This is a specific suggestion about a grade 10 class, but certainly applicable across different age groups. This is from Pam. Thank you, Pam. Asking, have you considered doing a community walk and identifying those aspects of students' neighborhood which are vulnerable or resilient to climate change? And this is an actual example that was done as a photo essay project with grade 10 students. So that's a really interesting suggestion, and one that I think would be very impactful with just getting students to think about it from a more local perspective, that it's not this big giant storm cloud that isn't in their everyday lives. It is something
Right.
very much in their communities. Just a few
Absolutely.
other notes going down here. Just a question, with your focus on action and advocacy, how do you deal with pushback from administrators and parents regarding left-wing political indoctrination? So just to ensure that I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm assuming this is regarding parents who may think that teaching climate change is a form of indoctrination. And that's certainly a topic with any kind of environmental education that we've been talking about for decades, is can we teach it without it getting into advocacy and indoctrination? I think certainly there's no question we can. How to do that, I'll put that to Shannon to start with, and we can maybe open that up as a broader discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very fine line to walk, and I think that it depends a lot on the site that you're teaching in. It depends on kind of the political climate of where you are, your school, your museum, your site. I've worked in places where it's very political. I've worked in places where I have been asked to not talk about certain things because of fear of retaliation. So it's a fine line to walk. I think that at the end of the day, it's important to present your students with the facts and let them decide. So with that, you can talk about actions that are more individual. I think that in my teaching approach, I try to use a mix of the individual actions and the more systemic actions to create a holistic idea of what we're going to do to save the environment. So obviously individual actions all on their own, like just telling a kid to turn off the lights every time they're in a room, that itself is not going to turn the climate crisis around. However, I think that there's something to be said for balancing the individual actions that kids feel ownership over, that they can start to build that awareness in their daily lives from a really young age, and then especially later bringing in the larger kind of social issues that go along with this. When you start going into environmental justice, environmental racism, it's going to be a really fine line to walk with staying, as impartial as you can while still presenting the facts. I've had colleagues that have just approached it, and also with students that have received information from parents that have been, climate deniers. I've had colleagues that have just focused on presenting things in a really impartial way and letting the students kind of come to their own decisions. And I think when we do that, when we focus on the facts, the accuracy of the sources, then I think that the students will kind of follow in a way that is very pro-environmental. But yeah, it's definitely a difficult place to walk, but I do think that it's important to not shy away too much from the advocacy kind of theme, because, we can talk about the environment all we want and the science and everything, but at the end of the day, if we're not doing anything about it, then it's kind of all for naught. So it's certainly an interesting issue, and I say, seek advice from your community of educators, from folks at your site, and kind of, take it day by day.
Yeah, and just continuing, and it's hard to keep up, and that is a very nice problem to have with so many people engaged here. Just a great question of asking for a list of realistic solutions and actions, and a lot of people have jumped on that and added all kinds of great resources. So again, I'll include in the follow-up email to everyone tomorrow just all of this text in the chat box. I'll separate out all of the resources so that those are very easy to find, because we've got lots of titles, lots of series, particular authors, and so on. If Shannon, if you have anything that you would recommend just in terms of very specific, realistic solutions and actions.
Yeah, I think kind of going off the previous point, it really depends on your age level that you're working with. So with the older students, I think that you can really start to bring in the more systemic actions. With the younger students, I think it's a good idea to start cultivating, especially with like the K through 3, cultivating the idea that our individual actions do make a difference. A lot of times in environmental education, there's a big debate between, oh, well, should we tell kids that, them turning off the lights or turning off the faucet when they wash their hands is gonna like do anything. Because realistically, if we don't have larger systemic changes, then it's those individual actions are not going to be what causes us to solve environmental issues. But I do think that especially with the younger kids, it's really important to cultivate that kind of mindset of sustainability from a young age, and that's a really great place for them to start. So things that I have done like that in the past, going to classrooms and creating posters or commitments like pledges in their class to commit to a certain number of things. The students can help you with researching this too. So this can kind of be incorporated into a research project, is them figuring out concrete ways that they can help. And there's a lot of really great articles and resources that are directed at kids on how to do this, whether that is targeting the amount of plastic we're using to the amount of time we're walking versus driving. There's a lot of different things that vary depending on your geographic area or the age group you're working with. But yeah, I think that it's another one of those things that you have to kind of figure out with your students, like what's relevant for them. And especially with the older students, I'm an advocate for kind of analyzing some of these broader systems at large, working in the environmental justice component when we can to talk about, how not only our individual actions play a role, but also the larger systems and processes.
Great, and just continuing right along here, there were some questions earlier on about, handling climate change in parks, nature centers, more informal or non-traditional educational settings. And I have a fairly extensive background in those types of settings. And oftentimes discussion of climate change is very much focused on change without that attachment of good or bad. So for example, if you're talking about breeding bird migration arrival times being pushed up, or the fact that here in southern Ontario we're seeing a northward range expansion of species like possums.
Mm-hmm.
You could look at those from a positive or negative perspective in and of themselves. I mean, to some people, maybe they're really excited that they get to see a mammal like a possum, like, wow, I've never seen one, and now they live here. That's kind of cool because they're interesting. They're the only marsupial in Canada. So, I mean, there are little moments that I've seen in parks-based and nature center-based interpretation where you're really just saying, yes, one of the contributing factors to this species arrival and establishment here is climate change, but it's not necessarily presented through a negative lens. It's just change. Certainly, that's not in any way to undermine the severity of the broader discussion of climate change and the impacts on ecosystems and humans and the economy and on and on and on. But that's an approach that I've seen work quite well in a park-based setting. And I don't know if Shannon, if you have anything to add to that point.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. I think that I've seen some organizations and national parks doing kind of taking that approach where it's kind of observing, collecting data, analyzing data about the trends that we're seeing over time. And I think, especially for outdoor education, that's a really great way to engage the students because obviously, when you're in the classroom, you're going to be a lot more limited from taking your kids to the closest national park most of the time and spending a whole day doing data collection and analysis and kind of figuring out what any of this looks like in the real world. So if you're in one of those situations, I think that's a really great way to take advantage of it. I think that informal educators have kind of an interesting challenge with that because if you are not in a situation where you are seeing those students multiple times, then you are going to be kind of limited with how much in-depth stuff you can get into. You know, if you only have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours with those students and you might not ever see that classroom again, you're going to have to adapt the approach to fit that environment. But I think that focusing on kind of that monitoring, the data collection, analysis is a great way. Something you can also talk about is like adaptations to your area's specific climate. So have animals, plants adapted to the climate that's here. And then as we have data from scientists that the climate in my area is changing, how is that going to affect our animals and plants and other organisms that are uniquely adapted to our climate? Here in San Diego, it's really easy to do that because we have a ton of little microclimates. So any little change here is going to start throwing everything off. So it's really easy to see that on a very small geographic scale. But I'm sure that there are also ways that folks from other climates all over the world could also kind of take that approach.
For sure. Just before we move on to the next question, I just added 2 links into the chat box just about Green Teachers' books, Teaching Teens About Climate Change and Teaching Kids About Climate Change. We do have them on special now. We know there's a lot of extra interest in this topic, and obviously with the global pandemic that we're dealing with, people are looking for additional resources since they're not able to go into schools. So again, we do have those 2 books on special. I've just added those links to the chat box. And ultimately our goal, and this is one of our big 2020 pushes in Green Teacher, and this is an internal project, is trying to get as many of these books on the shelves of classrooms, not just in North America, but certainly as a starting point, trying to get at least one of these books in every classroom in North America, or every school in North America, is one of our big pushes here at Green Teacher in 2020. The next question here is a tech-specific question. You know, right now, many of us, if not most or all of us, are teaching via Zoom or teaching remotely. So addressing climate change from a more remote setting. I'll let Shannon address that one first, and I've got a few thoughts to add to that as well afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's certainly an interesting situation because, you know, when I started preparing for this webinar, this topic a couple of months ago, this was not the reality that most of us were facing. So it's definitely interesting, and within, you know, my work, it's been a process trying to kind of figure out, you know, how can we adapt to what teachers need in this new setting. I think that there's some things that probably can translate fairly well, things like, you know, more like worksheets or activity books. Obviously, things like hands-on demos are going to be a lot harder to do with your students when they are at home. Maybe their internet access is kind of spotty, or, you know, if you have a younger student, the technical difficulties are there. I know that a lot of environmental organizations have been putting out online resources, sharing lesson plans, videos. So I would really recommend connecting with other folks in your area, looking up some of the nonprofits in your area, seeing what resources they have to offer. Because I've certainly been getting a lot of really cool emails about different online resources that are being put out, places like Scholastic and Time for Kids, and a lot of periodicals have been temporarily making access free for teachers that are teaching remotely or for students. And also, I think something that would be really cool is to work in like a citizen science aspect. So having kids taking data, you know, as much as they can from their own home, or using something like Zooniverse, which is a lot of times you're like analyzing camera trap data. Using those kind of crowdsourced platforms, that could be a good way as well to kind of start the conversation about how do we observe and catalog these patterns of change.
For sure. Another sort of recurring theme is this idea of empowering. And one person mentioned that, you know, right now with this global COVID-19 pandemic, we do have an opportunity. And I mean, we have to be careful with the wording here. Is in no way do we want to suggest in any way that this COVID-19 situation is positive. I mean, it's scary. We want to make sure everyone is safe and healthy. However, it has caused major changes in just basic operations to very, very fundamental aspects of society and culture. And there's been a lot of discussion, and I'm sure this is across the board, about the fact that people are saying, when are we going to get back to normal? And, first of all, what is normal? And all the aspects of quote unquote normal, do we want to go back to all of those aspects? Maybe this is an opportunity. And this is something I'm going to be mentioning in the editorial of our spring issue of the magazine, is this is an opportunity to learn. And yes, the first priority is making sure everyone is safe and healthy, but what are some things we can learn from this current situation? Again, I'll let Shannon touch on that to start with.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. So, going off of what you said, Ian, about just the basic functioning of our society and how that has been drastically disrupted from almost all of us by the current pandemic. I also think that there's a lot of really interesting ways that you could relate what is going on right now to the environment. So I know that there's been talk with different governments offering economic stimulus packages to, for example, like airlines. I saw something about the US and bailing out airlines, and certain advocates saying, well, maybe we should put in a little environmental clause there about they should limit their carbon emissions before we bail them out, things like that. That might be more of like a think piece for the teacher before they address it with the students, since something that's that political may or may not be suitable for your classroom. But there's a lot of really interesting effects that are happening and going to continue to happen as a result of COVID-19, and I'm really interested to see if there's any like lasting ecological benefits from all of this. I'm sure that a lot of folks have probably seen the headlines about, oh, Venice's canals are once again clear, the water's clear, you can see fish have returned and swans. So things like that, if you have any examples of that in your area or even just worldwide, they might be an interesting way to kind of discuss the pros and cons of these kinds of things with students. And obviously, we don't want to downplay the effect that this has on people. But I think that there is, it could be an interesting opportunity to open up some dialogue about that as well.
Great question that's come in here, and it's a very important part of this discussion, is dealing with non-believing students. Typically that comes from their family context, and a specific example is talking about cows and methane, but having to be very careful. I can relate to that. I live in a rural community, lots of dairy farmers, including dairy farmers right in my family, and this is a sore topic, around the dinner table at times, at Thanksgiving and Christmas and so on. So this person's suggesting the most responses can refer to basic conservation, which seems to work for most outside of the science. And again, I'll let Shannon elaborate on that point.
Yeah, I think that this is also something that's going to really vary depending on the area that you live in. So for me, I am living and working in like pretty urban San Diego. I have gone into a lot of different communities where there are different like political beliefs that may or may not affect students' understanding of climate change. I think that something that I've heard from, I haven't actually run into I think I've really only run into one or two students in my practice that have outright asked me like if climate change is real or not, or expressed disbelief over it being real. But again, that's really going to vary depending on where you are and who you're working with. I think it's important to acknowledge that it is like, it can hit home for a lot of people, especially if someone has a family member that, their lifestyle or their income revolves around an industry that is often demonized for, environmental impacts. I think that it is important to talk about how this is a problem for all of us and not just, putting the blame onto a certain group of people, that we all can do our part. And I think especially with, kind of students that are like climate deniers, I think it's really important to just be very honest with them, to ask them their thoughts, and also just present them with the facts as much as you can that are unbiased, objective, because I've heard from colleagues of mine that have had this situation arise that treating the students with respect, asking them to elaborate on why they believe those things, and then kind of working through with them on how scientists have arrived at these conclusions. That has really, like, without even having to push this idea that, oh, climate change is real, without even having to like consciously push that too much, those students have kind of come to understand, oh, maybe, certain sources I'm hearing this from have a certain agenda. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this, and I am by no means an expert on that, but I would also really, suggest reaching out to your community of educators, because if you haven't experienced it yet, I'm sure that someone in your community has. So also seeking out like professional development a lot of times will help with figuring out like specific evidence-based ways to address those kind of misconceptions. So.
Sure, and to piggyback on that, again, I mentioned I live in a rural community with dairy farmers, and yeah, this could be a sore spot. And just what I would recommend in discussions is just to be very open and honest, and share the resources. Say, yeah, these are the resources. This is the research it's based on, and just assure people, we're not trying to say that you're bad if you're a dairy farmer. We're just simply talking about the science. We're talking about how cows expel methane, and methane is a particularly strong greenhouse gas, and that the consumption of beef significantly contributes to climate warming. However, we're not in any way saying that you shouldn't be a cattle farmer or that you should feel ashamed of being a cattle farmer. And you never know what the individuals you're going to deal with, and there's some people that you can't come to a common ground with. But I've found, and I've been told by others, that just having that open discussion and assuring people that you're not trying to spin, you're just teaching the facts, and you're not trying to make any kind of shame or guilt as part of the lesson. And you can't go wrong with just the honesty of things.
Yep, I agree.
Just a very technical question for Shannon. If you've got a list, an extended list of youth activists, we had a request for that as well.
Sure, yeah, I have right offhand, I have a handful that I know of that I use in some of my presentations, and then I have like a few articles saved that have some really good lists. So I can present that, or I can add that into our list of resources that'll go out. Since I don't have them right offhand, but I spent a good amount of time like researching different youth activists from a whole bunch of different backgrounds. So I think, hopefully that'll be useful to you. So we can share that in the resources email.
Yeah, we'll share that in the follow-up. Still lots of great stuff coming in here. A question about migratory birds and species at risk, concerns over climate change, certainly a very prescient issue. Asking any activities and games you can do with kindergarten students and grade 1 curriculum. This is a British Columbia specific question.
Okay.
Obviously, depending on where in British Columbia, may or may not be a coastal area. Again, the two Green Teacher books, teaching kids and teaching teens about climate change, do touch in part on migratory birds. Both of those books have very hands-on activities touching on different aspects of climate change. Migratory birds just being one of those, coastal areas being another one. I can't specifically speak to the British Columbia curriculum since I'm based in Ontario, but if anyone does have a particular insight in that, by all means, add that to the chat box. Again, just everyone, thank you so much for all of these resources. This is absolutely fantastic, and we're going to be really excited to share this with everyone tomorrow. It's overwhelming, and I say that in a good way. We're overflowing, and it's great. Really,
yeah, thank you everyone
really,
for your contributions. It'll be a great learning experience for me too, to sift through everything.
For sure, and we'll spend some time on our end here at Green Teacher just going through this, and we can certainly share a lot of this through our social media channels and during our upcoming webinars throughout Earth Month here. This is our first of 4 webinars, and it's been a great start. I hate to wrap things up, but I did promise 60 minutes, and we've just gone beyond that. We can still linger for a little while longer, but I do want to do the formal wrap up.
All right.
So just before we finish, again, I'd like to thank today's feature webinar partner. We have many webinar partners in Canada and the US, but Tonight's feature webinar partner is the Columbia Basin Environmental Education Network. So thank you very much to them for their support. Again, I mentioned the 2 Green Teacher books. Our goal, our big push here in 2020 is to get at least one of those books in every school across North America and beyond. Those books are teaching kids about climate change and teaching teens about climate change. And given the situation we're in, we have those 2 books on special. Above all, though, the biggest thank you goes to our presenter, Shannon. You handled every question with professionalism and specificity, and that was a great follow-up to a really in-depth presentation which addressed a lot of the questions we had at the outset, and I think you did a great job of distilling the intricacies of addressing climate change in multiple educational contexts. So thank you very, very much, Shannon. You contributed that wonderful article for our fall issue, and then taking the time to put this together and connecting us at a time when we are physically disconnected, but we're finding other ways to connect. And Shannon, again, thank you so much for your part in allowing us to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much again for having me. It's been an awesome experience, and I really look forward to learning from all of our participants to, being able to see all of the resources and suggestions. That'll also be a learning experience for me. So thank you to everyone who joined. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be with us.
Definitely, and we'd love to know what you thought, any additional ideas you've got. I just added to the chat box the link to the Survey Monkey. It's probably something many of you have used. It's a really short survey, just a few questions, would probably only take 2 or 3 minutes to fill it out. We'd love to hear what you thought, what you would like to see more of in Green Teacher webinars. Typically, we don't plan webinars on short notice, but given the situation we're in, we are adding webinars at a quick rate here, and we'll be doing so through the month of May, given the situation that we're in. So if anyone has ideas or would like to propose to present a webinar that we could host, just send an email, ian@greenteacher.com. Article ideas as well. With people at home now, not commuting, maybe a bit of extra time, maybe this is the opportunity to share an activity or a resource that you would love to share. Green Teacher, that's what we exist to do. So we'd be happy to begin that discussion. I've just added my email to the chat box there. This has really been an enriching evening. It's going to take time, I think, intellectually just to decompress and unpack all of the intricate ideas that have been addressed, and I say that in the best way possible. Just another quick logistical note, anyone who's requested a certificate of participation, you will receive that in the next couple days. And starting tomorrow, this webinar, the recording, will be freely available for anyone for 30 days. And if you are a subscriber, you have access to approximately 100 of our Green Teacher webinars, including this one. All of that on greenteacher.com. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We'll add all of the information from the chat box, all of the resources in the follow-up email tomorrow. If you have additional questions, you can email me, you can email Shannon. The recording will be up on the website. And our next webinar is Wednesday next week, The Joy of Garden-Based Education, which is the second of our 4 Green Teacher webinars here in Earth Month, leading up to the publication of our spring issue on Earth Day itself. So thank you everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you have joined us from. It has been an enriching experience, and we hope to connect with you again soon, and most importantly, be healthy and be well.